Cardenal Cisneros.
Buenas tardes de nuevo, buenas tardes a todos. Confío en que Santo di Nuovo me pueda oír. Si nos haces algún gesto to show that you can hear me. Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Bueno, voy a comenzar diciendo una obviedad, o al menos lo que confío en que sea una obviedad, que es que yo no soy María Sinatra. María Sinatra debía estar aquí presentando a Santo di Nuovo, pero por desgracia está enferma y no ha podido venir. Le subió la fiebre, me contaba ayer que le subió la fiebre hace unos días, inesperadamente, y no ha podido estar aquí acompañándonos. Así que ocupo su lugar para presentaros brevísimamente al profesor Santo di Nuovo, que es presidente de la Asociación Italiana de Psicología, catedrático emérito de la Universidad de Catania, antes fue catedrático de la Universidad de Palermo, y que ha dedicado toda su carrera investigadora al campo de la psicometría, aplicada en distintos ámbitos. Desde hace ya unos años viene trabajando en un libro sobre la historia de la psicometría, o más en general sobre la historia de los intentos de cuantificación, de medida de los procesos mentales, y fue precisamente María Sinatra, como miembro del comité científico de esta 34ª edición del Symposium, quien nos propuso que Santo nos presentara su trabajo en este contexto. Muchas gracias, Santo. Thank you so much por prestarte a honrarnos con tu presencia. Things should have been different. We should have had you here, but family matters. A couple of weeks ago, if I remember correctly, made you
Thank you.
Choose to address us on Zoom rather than in Madrid. Of course, we understood. So thank you for being here, and please, we are listening.
Bien. Buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Me siento honrado de estar aquí con ustedes, incluso a la distancia. Siendo no poder estar presente en España, que siempre veo con mucho gusto, pero la visita de mis dos hijos y mi sobrina a Sicilia no me permitió dejarlos. No puedo hablar bien español, así que hablaré inglés. Espero que las diapositivas te ayuden a entender mejor mi presentación. Ahora les comparto el vídeo y comencemos. In search of objectivity for measuring mind, history of assessment instruments for psychological testing. This is the issue of my talk. This is the overview. First, the early reactive instruments. Second, a basic question, the sense of measuring. Third, beyond the limits of objective psychometrics. Fourth, personality testing, inventories and projective techniques. And as last, conclusions. Test as an experimental trial. Edward Titchener wrote in 1902 that the psychological experiment with humans consists of a series of introspections conducted under standard conditions. This aspect differentiates experiments with humans from those with animals or natural objects, typical of laboratory research, which use methods shared with other disciplines. For example, physiology, physics, and chemistry, nowadays neuroscience. The early attempts to quantify individual responses to standard stimuli, the test as a diagnostic reactive, were developed to measure the differences among persons in responding to standardized stimuli administered under standardized conditions. Is this the objectivity we are searching for? In this psychological test, introspection was the basis for understanding the required task and giving verbal or performance responses to the stimuli. The psychometric criteria introduced a specific aim, not included in psychological experiments in the laboratory, comparing these responses with normative parameters. In his anthropometric laboratory, Francis Galton aimed at measuring psychophysical behaviors in samples of thousands of people through his reactive, mainly based on reaction times to visual and auditory stimuli. This is the Galton laboratory in London. James McKean Cattell imported Galton's methods to the United States, firstly defining mental tests which were not limited to behavioral responses, but included verbal answers to verbal stimuli. But is it possible to measure objectively the subjective aspects of human mind using the test as a portable laboratory? What is the predictive values of mental tests on the daily life abilities? An example derived from academic achievement. Several children with high levels of intelligence, as measured by the test, were poor learners, and vice versa. The first mental test measured only a part of mental abilities useful for a complete diagnosis, since they were based almost only on reaction times, as in laboratory. Therefore, success in academic learning and emotional adaptation to the context were only partially connected to the specific skills measured by the test, as this success depends on other subjective and social variables not assessed by the reactive. Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon prepared an intelligent test aimed at reliably predict what students had differentiated educational needs. This is Alfred Binet in his psychometric laboratory at the Sorbonne University in Paris. As a coincidence, Binet and Simon presented their test at the 50th International Congress of Psychology, 1905, held in Rome, in the same session in which Sante De Santis, a well-known psychologist in Italy, psychiatrists and psychologists, also presented a reactive to evaluate intellectual defects applied in the kindergartens. The first kindergartens in Italy was built by De Santis. The common author's goal was to separate as far as possible the measurement of intellectual abilities from the level of education, avoiding tasks similar to those used at school, as was in the usual pedagogical approach. A Sicilian scholar immigrated to Milan, Umberto Saffiotti, studied the Binet test extensively, both in South and in North Italy, and came to conclusion which contested some of its fundamental assumptions. The test considered mental age in terms of cognitive tasks without taking into account relationship with the level of education. Moreover, methodologically incorrectness was found in calculating the order of increasing difficulty of the task. Saffiotti, in 1916, proposed to replace the criterion of mental age with degrees of mental development. The cautions suggested by Saffiotti and by Binet himself have not been followed by those who use tests to measure intelligence. This construct is often considered objectively measurable, like physical and behavioral variables. Let me show the debate on objectivity through the international conferences of psychotechnics, l'Associazione Internationale de Psychotechnique. First 8 congresses were in Geneva, then in Barcelona, where the organizer was Mirai Lopez, together with Castella, Milan, Ferrari, Paris, Lagi, Utrecht, then Barcelona again, then Moscow, Prague, and after the Second World War, in Bern. In these congresses was debated the possibility to assess aptitudes to work by means of objective psychometric instruments. But Giulio Cesare Ferrari, a well-known Italian psychologist, the founder of the Rivista di Psicología in Italy, wrote that the psychophysical part of psychological research, that is, chronometry and experimental techniques, cannot complete the entire scientific organization. The Geiger phenomena of thought, reasoning, will, affectivity have been neglected. The human factor and the subconscious aspect of the personality was not considered. Psychometric instruments measure only a part of the mind. For example, cognitive aptitudes. And now came to Wechsler. When David Wechsler proposed the revision of IQ, passing from mental ratio with chronological age to QI deviation from the norm, as deviation from norm, he defined the intelligence measured by tests as cognitive intelligence, while conative and non-intellective intelligence, this is very interesting, this definition of non-intellective intelligence by Wechsler, determines adaptive behavior and success in life. General intelligence cannot be equated with intellectual ability, but must be regarded as a manifestation of the personality as a whole. This sentence is drawn from the first edition of the Wechsler manual of his test. But also this definition was underestimated by the users of Wechsler scales, provoking what was defined recently by Mühlberg and Rogele as IQ test wars. In 1960s, the general contestation of the tools of experimental science also involved the mental tests. This is well known, the book named The Brain Watchers, Scrutatori di cervelli, by Gross. The criticism of the quantitative and objective evaluation of intellectual abilities was supported by the famous Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Men. The mismeasure of men. IQ, said Gould, cannot be assumed as an autonomous quality of the human mind. The number reporting the intelligence of each person is a statistical artifact applied to specific performance required by the test. A statistical artifact, not a quality of the mind. Let me go to the second issue and pose the basic question. What is the sense of measuring applied to the mind? Well, we have to differentiate the measurement that involves psychophysical or neurophysiological variables, easily isolable and analytically evaluable, the evaluation of more complex cognitive and emotional functions of the human mind. As Wechsler said, the whole personality. In the first case, the assessment tools are those typical of the psychotechnical laboratory, which contributed to the birth of the experimental psychology as an autonomous and objective science. For example, chronoscopes for measuring response times, tachystoscopes for the fast decoding of visual stimuli, polygraphs for quantifying physiological variables. This is a polygraph. This photo was taken for the laboratory of Maria Sinatra, my colleague in Italy. A portable test of psychophysiological measures. Is the test the same thing? Today, these tools are replaced by advanced neuroimaging techniques, fMRI, SPECT, PET, spectral analysis, etc., and by computer programs that evaluate cognitive and psychophysiological functions with great precision in the presentation of stimuli and in the recording of responses. More precision than in Wundt's laboratory, but the same logical as the first logic of Wundt. All these procedures have very high reliability in measuring the variables, avoiding introspection. But is what measured the whole mind? For example, these are 3 slides extracted by the testing of a Computerized test for attention and concentration. The measurement of attention using a computerized program that presents the stimuli, records reaction times, errors, and any omissions of responses, and produces a report of the results of each subject for several areas of attention and concentration. The first at right is a test of simple reaction times. The second, in the middle, is a test of choice reaction times. The last is a cancellation test derived from Toulouse-Piron, the old Toulouse-Piron test. The precision of the computerized program allows to measure some characteristics of mind with very great precision. Otherwise, when the object of measurement is a complex psychological construct, such as intelligence, personality, social adaptability, stress, job satisfaction, the measurement should ground the accuracy and validity of the scores on different, very different criteria of verification. To assess cognitive efficiency or profit requires to the subject the maximum performance, regards cognitive aptitude or profit test. While to evaluate the typical performance of the subjects requires to manifest or describe themselves without time limits and without the demand for efficiency in performance. This includes typically personality or adaptation tests, but also tests evaluating cognitive style. This distinction is drawn from an article by Ackerman, 1994. Consequently, the quantitative and/or qualitative evaluation criteria needed in this specific situation of assessment will be different. We have to create differentiation of assessment and measuring of mind. Let's go beyond the limits of objective psychometrics in history of psychology. The definition of a psychometric test, that is an objective instrument of assessment, involves critical points regarding the incidence of the subjectivity of both the administrator and the respondent. understanding of stimuli. This is the first issue, very relevant in many situations. Second, the interaction between the administrator of the test and the responding subject, very different than in the assessment by computer of the reaction times. Testing with problematic subjects, for example, intellectual disability, cognitive deterioration in old people. One of the first textbooks on intellectual test by Weipel, 1914. You have to pay attention to the emotional attitude of the subject toward the test, the ability to understand what you want from them, and the will to do their best in the whole test. This is a sentence I explain to my students now. It's very, very important for the issue we are discussing. Specific technical procedures can resolve some of this issue. There are specific procedures that can cope with these problems, while others require different testing criteria. For example, qualitative and dynamic assessment. Psychometric tests measure the product, the degree of efficiency of cognitive functions. A different assessment if needed to grasp the way of functioning of the cognitive process. There is a great difference from the product and the process. We know well the construct by Vygotsky of potential development area, or the clinical approach by Piaget. A process-oriented dynamic testing is diffused in educational psychology, but also in neuropsychological assessment, due to difficulty of maintaining the norms for administering and evaluating the psychometric tests with patients suffering from neurological diseases. This is the great lesson of neuropsychologists as Goldstein, as Luria, as Edith Kaplan. In the picture, there is the neuropsychological test by Goldstein and Shearer, the famous Goldstein and Shearer battery, 1941, for assessing concrete and abstract thinking in persons with disabilities, with neurological defects, in impairment, cognitive impairment in elderly, and so on. I use it for many times. This test is very, very important, but it's not psychometric logic, but a process-oriented testing we call dynamic testing. Feuerstein, who was a pupil of Piaget, following the Piagetian school, proposed for testing people with mental disability, an instrument based on criteria not strictly psychometric. Although using some psychometric tests, like Raven progressive matrices, but in another logic, a qualitative logic. Models and methods of dynamic assessment have been promoted. There are some of the authors, Leeds, Kerson and Wiedel, Haywood and Suriel. Also Suriel is from the school of Feuerstein, Stenberg and Grigorenko. The dynamic assessment aims to understand the functioning of the cognitive process, how the subject proceeds in responding to standardized stimuli. Stimuli are standardized, but the focus of the testing is how the subject proceeds. The difficulty can be varied and tailored with the skills revealed by the subject himself or herself. And this is very important for the real measurement of these abilities. Now is development the adaptive testing. The first computerized adaptive testing followed this line of research, pursued an established concept of individualized instruction for the diagnostic proposals. Progressive adjustment of the test to the current state of knowledge and performance of the subject, to avoid proposing tests that are too difficult or too easy, but starting from the baseline determined at the beginning of testing. This is the adaptive testing. Tasks are progressively adapted to the level reached in individualized sequences. Currently, the subject's level is automatically deduced by the software administering the test. Responses are calibrated on this preliminary assessment, which is fully automated. This does not depend only on age, but on the preliminary responses of the subjects and their baseline in the assessed competence. In part, what was already in Binet-Simon assessment of intelligence. Tests are tailored on specific subjects and therefore result more appropriate and precise for extreme cases. This is a design for demonstrating, summarizing in two lines what is an adaptive testing. A variable sequence of tasks due to the subject level. The first pattern, the second pattern, when some tasks are not correspondent to the level of the subject. This is now fully automated, but the logic is the same logic of dynamic testing and qualitative assessment, individualized assessment. In this way, the artificial system can adapt the evaluation criteria to the specific case, then verifying the changes following enabling or rehabilitative interventions, which can be implemented by the same system through human and or artificial agent. In the photo, to application to by a robot named Pepper, we use widely for this kind of adaptive testing with child and with other persons. We have a system to assessing mild cognitive impairment in this way by Pepper or other robots, which applied adaptive testing to the specific needs and levels of the person. Fourth, personality testing, inventories and projective techniques. Moreover, personality tests pose several problems in the attempts of measuring objectively the subjective aspects of the mind. Can personality tests be objective? The early trials to measure personality traits were developed in the 20s of the last century in the fields of personal selection, for example, in the military forces. Self-report scales and questionnaire included the Woodward personal data sheet, we can see at right, used for the psychiatric screening of new conscripts in the First World War. The Woodward personal data sheet was published in during the first global war. Many manuals define personality inventories as objective, contraposing to projective. But self-report instruments have an introspective and therefore subjective basis. Objectivity is true, but objectivity concerns the rigorous standardization of the questions that constitute them, and the resulting scores can be obtained in an equally standard way. This is objective. But to answer the question, the respondent uses self-report, that is, a series of introspections conducted under standardized conditions, as teacher argued many years ago. When a subject admits to feeling anxious or depressed on a multi-level scale, requesting to evaluate each item as very much, quite, a little, and so on, is this self-assessment objective? As each level of the scale of evaluation the same meaning for all the respondents, the answer don't reflect the objective level of anxiety as measurable by psychophysiological tools, but the perceived anxiety, the perceived stress, the perceived depression. Another relevant aspect, depending on the subjective interpretation of the stimuli, is the possibility of alteration, voluntary or not, of the response. Paradoxically, just in the test considered as objective, the possibility of falsifying the answers is greater, being the items very transparent. For example, I'm often angry and aggressive. Score 1 to 5. The subject of a judicial testing, a perizia, no? may attempt to falsify this response to avoid negative consequence. He understands, well, this is not useful to present himself or herself as angry and aggressive, very angry and very aggressive. The main tests in this category of the inventories include control scales, that warn of the subject tendency to deceive and mislead. This is present in Minnesota multifaceted personality inventory, in personality assessment inventory, and so on. But apart from some corrections always to the scale scores, for example, in the Minnesota or other tests, the elevation of the control scales makes the test unreliable and therefore unusable for forensic purposes. It is not possible to consider this test as a proof in a juridical situation. Let me see the projective techniques. There are different types of personality tests. While maintaining the standardization of the stimuli and less rigorous in the evaluation, so a greater subjectivity of the scorer, even if the objectivity of the scoring is not abolished at least for some part of them. In some part, the objectivity of scoring can be maintained. In other part, the evaluation is more clinical. On the other hand, the possibility of voluntary falsifying the answer is very limited in this case. These tests are called projective. In the logic of projecting the inner of the person in the responses. Many manuals of psychometrics and many practitioners consider them less objective than the inventories. And this is partially true. But following Meyer and Kurtz, is it time to retire objective and projective as personality test descriptors? I think so. The association test devised by Jung in the first year of the last century responded to the psychoanalytical assumption that emotions and personality interfere with remembering. This is projection in the Freudian, in psychoanalytic interpretation. The interference of the memory, affective memory also, on the response with unstructured stimuli. Freud himself admitted that these techniques could build the first bridge from experimental psychology to psychoanalysis. It's very interesting, this sentence by Freud. The Swiss psychiatrist, well-known Hermann Rorschach, in 1921, in the same period when the early inventories were introduced, during the First World War, presented the 10 diagnostic tables consisting of standard incubus as a particular modality to study the personality through the perception. It's very interesting, this definition by Rorschach himself. Study of personality through the perception. Only after his death was defined the Rorschach test as projective. In the United States, Rorschach spoke of personality analysis through the perception. The set of scores attributed in evaluating the Rorschach test can be summarized in a quantitative synthesis that allows for some variables or groupings of them a reference to normative values, both in the normal and pathological populations. Quantitative synthesis. This is an example. Psychogramma, with the variables in a subject. The test has some psychometric components with satisfactory reliability and validity. For example, in the well-known Exner's comprehensive system. It's the most developed, the most used system of scoring of Rorschach in the world now. Fully admitted in the juridical context. Although the theoretical and methodological structure is very different from traditional personality tests based on inventories. But some components of the test are satisfactory, have satisfactory reliability and validity. How reliable and valid are the deductions derived from tests such as the Rorschach or the Murray Thematica Perception test or drawing-based tests? We have three very different categories of projective techniques. Some deductions are more reliable and valid. Some are very less reliable and valid, and more and have more clinical validity. Let me show these two designs. Two drawings of a person. These drawings are produced by the same person, a young lady, before and after a therapy for psychosis. The first of this drawing is a very low level, while after 20 days, the perception of the body is completely changed after the therapy. This shows the very high utility of the test, but it's not a psychometric test. Are all these tests free expression of the imagination, as in early word association tests by Jung? Some of them have parts suitable for psychometric analysis. Others, or other parts, like in Rorschach, have a clinical qualitative use. The Rorschach and other projective techniques, if correctly used, can give some reliable and valid answers to the person's overall assessment, alongside, or in some cases and contexts, as an alternative to other tests based on more solid psychometric basis. This Hibbard in 20 years ago. In some juridic context, the use of inventories is less usable than other clinical and projective techniques. Other issues concerning psychometric testing, I can only said in one sentence, because I have no time to explain all these problems. The first are the cultural influences, and there are many attempts attempts to find culture-free instruments, or at least culture-fair. There is a subtle but interesting difference between culture-free, what is independent, totally independent from culture, and the conclusion are that this is not possible, while culture-fair are adaptation of the test and of the norms of the test to specific cultures. And this is very possible. The second issue are the relational aspects of the administering psychometric test. How is it important the way of administering test, the comprehension of the instruction on the part of the subject, of the respondent? And this has consequences both by human or by computer or artificial agent. There are three main categories of relational aspects. Humans, for computer, many tests have been adapted in the last period of pandemics for the use by computer, by the telematic use. Very different relational aspects. And this is a great issue of the contemporary, non-historical, not the historical psychology. And by artificial agent, another great problem with involved relational aspects. Some conclusions. My time is next to end. Is the test a portable equivalent of experimental, aseptic, and objective techniques as believed in the early stage of the history of psychometrics? And some continue to believe. A first equivocal assumption is that the mind is analyzable on a par with its neurophysiological components. This is an assumption diffused in neurosciences now. The mental test would constitute for the psychological functions an equivalent of EEG, of MRI, for the organic modes of functioning. But this is not true. This assumption leads to an ambiguous definition of objectivity in psychological measurement. We remember what teacher said about psychological experiments, which he considered a series of introspections conducted under standard conditions. The test is objective, is reliably subtracted from the subjectivity of the examiner. However, answers are still subjective as they are the result of an introspective act of the subject examined. The history of psychometrics and the epistemological reflection on it dispel illusory expectation of absolute objectivity from clients, teachers, psychiatrists, judges in juridical context, but shared also by many psychologists, unfortunately, I said. Nevertheless, psychological testing includes tools that can reliably ascertain specific skills or their lack for educational, juridical, or rehabilitative purposes. Testing concerns tools that study also constructs more general and defined in a less shared way. For example, intelligence and personality. In these cases, they allow the nosographic classification of the individuals in categories, however uncertainly defined. Rather, they can allow the understanding of the psychological conditions and functions that favor or prevent the manifestation of the individual's intellectual and emotional potential, or affect their mental well-being. History of psychology confirms that for these different aims and uses, there are reliable and valid tests if properly constructed and correctly used, as long as there is an epistemological awareness of the nature of each instrument and the degree of objectivity it allows to achieve. Thank you for your attention, and I think this was useful to conclude your day of scientific congress.
Thank you so much, Santo. È stata una conferenza meravigliosa.
Forse troppo lunga. Too long, perhaps.
No, don't worry. It was fascinating. I wonder if there might be some questions from the audience. We still have a little time, not much, but if there are questions from the audience, we might pass them to you.
Sí, se oye. Professor Santo, this is Gabriel Ruiz from University of Seville, Spain.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your interesting conference. We highly appreciate your historical analysis of the instrument for assessment of intelligence and other dimension of the person. I wonder if you notice that, in my opinion, there is different meaning of objectivity in different moments in the history of psychology.
Yeah.
It's difficult to compare the definition of Titchener about what is objective with our definition of what is objective. Titchener tend to think that objective is related with the immediate experience. I mean, is really what we now understand for subjective. So my question is, if you use in your analysis only one meaning of objectivity, or if you are notice that there are different meanings of objectivity along history.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I've quoted the Titchener's meaning because he's the more diffused now in Italian psychology, among Italian psychologists, when they use instruments confusing the different levels and the different meanings of subjectivity and objectivity. This is a great problem for the, in Italy, perhaps, the assessment of psychological of psychological components of the mind. And I see that many practitioners are confused about these different meanings of objectivity. They think that tests are objective. Clinical instruments, interview, is subjective. This is a great problem, a very big problem in the comprehension of what are the best methods for assessing. And the aim of the book we are quoted at the beginning, how measure mind, written by edited by Maria Sinatra and myself, has the aim to clarify what are the objective instruments for assessing the mind, and what are the subjective parts of the instrument we intended generally to be objective. This is the main problem in psychometrics now in Italy, and I think in Europe, because there is great confusion between this meaning, as you correctly said.
Just a second.
Doesn't work? Oh, yeah. Thank you a lot for your interesting talk. I was wondering, it's a bit related to the previous question, because you put the word objective very consistently between quotation marks. So I sense a bit of uncomfortableness with this meaning of this word. But then you also later say, for instance, you say that there is an objective level of anxiety and then a perceived level. And for me, this kind of implies that you mean to say that this perceived level of anxiety is somehow less real than this objective level of anxiety, however, whatever that might mean. So I wondered, what is your personal position on this question? Do you think that this perceived level is somehow less or more real than this objective level?
Thank you. Thank you for your question. The problem for me is not what is real. This is another big problem. We can have a discussion on this. If I was with you after dinner, it's not possible. I think there are many ways to assess the real contents and the processes of the mind. There are methods that follows psychometric rules. There are also the methods that following clinical rules, and the integration of these methods is the reality of what as the person feel to be anxious, as the person is anxious as measured by psychophysiological instruments. The reality is the integration of these methods. The separated analysis obviously leads to a bias. in the measuring of mind. So the real behavior is what we can see, but the exterior or through the physiological instruments, but the real psychological perception of anxiety can be more important in some situation, in some clinical situation. I think the object, also the objectivity of the measurement is to relate to the aim of the assessment. What we want to make with the assessment. Is this a diagnostic problem? And the useful things is to categorize the person in a category of psychiatric or psychological category. It is intellectual disability. It is cognitive impairment, mild cognitive impairment. It is depression. It is the second aim could be the juridic aim, the assessment of the capacity of know and will in the forensic approach. This is another problem. The third is the assessment of the baseline for clinical intervention, for rehabilitative intervention. In this case, the qualitative methods are more important for me. The process analysis is more important than the categorization. After I have categorized a child as intellectual disability, what is the problem for the rehabilitation? I can use the assessment for the diagnosis and then to assign support to the il sostegno. We can, in Italy, the teacher of support. But the problem for the rehabilitation is very different. The problem is to assess how the child functions, how are the abilities in, as said Vygotsky, in a level proximal to the best of the function, or very far from this level. And the functioning of the mind is very different from the categorization of the results. This is my conception of the reality. The reality depends on what we want to obtain with the assessment. And the instruments have to be connected to this aim, I think. This is a very applicative problem, not only theoretical, but an everyday problem for the psychologists in Italy, and I think also in other countries. Well, I think we have the dinner now. I am the last obstacle.
It is a lot. Yes, it's been a long day here in Madrid. The first talk began at 9:30 in the morning, so I guess it's time to take a rest.
I understand.
Thank you so much once again for a wonderful talk, and it's a shame you can't come with us to continue the conversation over dinner, but we'll be in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to all, to your all.
Cardenal Cisneros, en marcha.